Robin.
Robin.
What?
You know we have a job, right?
We're trying to do a thing here.
Oh, geez. Okay, give me a minute. Good evening and welcome to For Your Reference. I'm Robin Biedenbow.
I'm Ingrid Ruffin.
I'm Casey Fox.
And we are some of your friendly neighborhood librarians from here at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville.
It is
Thanks for waking me up, y'all.
You're welcome. It is so nice of all of y'all to join us tonight. We are back again to navigate the world of media and information literacy with the help of guest scholars.
But first, I'd like to talk some more about my cat.
Okay, so we're on the internet, and that's basically what the internet was invented for, cats.
All right. So if you watch the first episode, you'll probably remember the story of my cat, Tiger, who found a snake in her house and tried to eat it. You will probably not be surprised that a cat with this level of enthusiasm for consuming other animals, he's a big guy, just generally kind of big boned, but let's be honest, he's fat. And the vet has been working with us we're working with him on his diet, but he is also on a little bit of a fitness journey. And I believe we have some video. It's going about as well as you would expect.
Oh, Tiger. With everything going on in the world right now, watching that cat spinning in a wheel and not getting anywhere feels like a pretty apt metaphor.
Yeah. And but there's a lot of people working very hard to move the dial on some really vital issues, like tonight's guest.
Yes, we have some very special guests with us tonight to talk about reproductive justice. This is Reviewer 2. Our first guest tonight is Dr. Leah Hernandez. She is an assistant professor in the Department of Communication at Utah Valley University. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. Super thrilled to be here.
Cool. Well, first, why don't you tell us a little bit about you and your work?
Yeah, so my research interests lie at the intersections of health communication, gender studies, and media studies. So more specifically, in a health communication context, I research gender violence, violence against women, more particularly women of color, and also reproductive justice.
Cool. So over the first couple of episodes, when we were doing this Reviewer 2 segment, we sort of, explored the concept of Reviewer 2, which is a thing a lot of academics understand. I don't want to spend too much time on that definition of that trope this time, but if you could describe Reviewer 2 in one word, what would that word be?
Demoralizing.
That is an outstanding word. So, playing the role of Reviewer 2 tonight is Dr. Sarah de los Santos Upton. She is an assistant professor in the Department of Communication at the University of Texas at El Paso. Welcome to the show.
Hello, glad to be here.
Yeah, and I always like to remind people the Reviewer 2 that we have invited here is, and Leah, help me if I'm wrong, nothing like Reviewer 2. So
I hope not.
So, Sarah, why don't you tell us a little bit about you and your work before we get you two started?
Thanks. So I'm primarily interested in the intersections of border identity, reproductive health and reproductive justice, and environmental communication.
Cool. So, let's see. The question that you two will be discussing this evening is, how can we better leverage reproductive justice and health and communication? Now, I'm going to let y'all take it away. I'll be back in just a little while for the Q&A.
Awesome. All right. So for all of our amazing viewers out there, Dr. Upton and I recently published an article entitled Transgender Migrant Rights, Reproductive Justice, and the Mexico-U.S. Border in the Time of COVID-19. Say that 5 times fast. So in the article, we talk a little bit about how violence against transgender women at the U.S.-Mexico border is fundamentally a violation of reproductive justice, or put differently, it's reproductive injustice. And we talk a little bit about Roxana Hernandez and Joanna Medina, and the ways in which the media framed their cases problematically, the way in which the media used their dead names, and really just the way in which it was discussed and some of the harms associated with that. So Sarah, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself growing up in the U.S.-Mexico borderlands and kind of how that shapes your approach to this topic?
Thank you so much. Yes, I teach at the University of Texas at El Paso, but I was actually born and raised in El Paso. And so I feel a very deep connection to the border itself. It shapes who I am in the world, how I see the world, the way I approach scholarship. And so for me, being here on the border and witnessing the injustices that not only, I think a lot of times when people think about reproductive justice, they think about, a woman's right to choose, to have control over her own body, which is incredibly important, an important aspect of reproductive justice. But, being here when children were being separated from their parents, I was witnessing a reproductive justice issue happening, in the place where I live, and attending protests with other families, thinking through what would it mean, to have our children taken from us. So I think, it's one thing to, I was watching the news along with everyone else, but I was also here when Customs and Border Protection and ICE were just dropping people off in the middle of the street on Christmas Eve to try to create a spectacle and a crisis, a media crisis, so that they could paint this picture that, migrants are here taking over the streets of El Paso, when, being from a border community that is welcoming to migrants and flourishes because it's a migrant community, I know that that's not the case. So tying it back, that it really illuminated, and I know that you can relate to this idea that reproductive justice goes beyond, having autonomy over your own body, but it's about families, as we've talked about with one another in our research, going back to, organizations like Sister Song have reminded us that reproductive justice also includes that right to parent your children in safe communities. So we should be thinking about what kinds of environments surround our communities. How are parents given agency to parent and to stay with their children and not have their children taken away? And when you're fleeing, as is the case with many of the transgender migrants that we were discussing in this article, when you are fleeing a country because it is unsafe to be who you are and identify the way that you identify and just live freely, you should be able to come and seek asylum and be protected instead of criminalized, instead of put into unsafe conditions in ICE detention centers. And so we really need to think about reproductive justice really broadly when we're thinking about it in a border context and just generally.
Yeah, thank you for that. And you did such a great job, I think, showing us what it's like from the vantage point of someone who lives there, right? Was born and raised there and is seeing this regularly. Now, for those of you all who aren't familiar with our research, Sarah and I were both born and raised in Texas and have really spent the last, 5 to 7 years, right, thinking about reproductive justice for women of color, more particularly for Latina women, Latinx individuals, and also Latin American women. And we were both really inspired to work on this topic, particularly when we started seeing news articles over the last several years about injustices both here and abroad, and then also recently at the border, particularly for transgender migrants. Just to give y'all a snippet from our article, there was one transgender migrant, her name was Shakira Chilel, and when she arrived at her detention center, she began having stomach problems and other associated health issues. Coupled with the sexual trauma and persecution that she faced in both Guatemala and Mexico, her trauma was further compounded when she was in the camps, and also further compounded by COVID. So, I mean, that's a whole other issue here that we may be able to touch on if we have time. So she told a facility medical worker that she wanted to throw herself out of the window, which resulted in her being placed in solitary confinement, and then the inhumane treatment just spiraled from there. So, Sarah, maybe we could talk a little bit here about how we see reproductive justice, like informing how we see what's going on in the border, particularly for transgender women and transgender migrants.
Well, I think we've talked a lot about in conversation with one another, but also in our writing, we've talked about the ways in which there should be coalition building, building off of the work of Karma Chavez, this idea that it's necessary to build coalitions among issues that, maybe previously we haven't thought about them as being intimately connected. But when we think about migrant rights, when we think about reproductive justice, there is a lot of overlap there. And if we can build coalitions among organizations working, follow the lead of the people on the ground who know what they're doing around these issues, and work in collaboration, in coalitions with one another, I think that is a really important way to address the reproductive injustices at the Mexico-U.S. border, and to center, the most marginalized experiences, like these experiences of transgender migrants who are receiving really inhumane treatment in ICE detention centers. I think it's important. We've talked about, one small way to do that is to think about, where do you access your own reproductive health care, and how accessible is this space? We've talked about this birth center in El Paso, Luna Tierra, that the second that you enter the space, that people of all races are welcome in this space, and people of all multiple different gender identities are welcome in this space. And they're clear through their use of signage in the clinic, through their use of language on forms. They're very clear and adamant about making sure that it's a space where people from different identity positions feel welcomed. And I think that accessing care there versus a space that is very exclusionary to different people from different backgrounds is just one small thing that works, in the service of a larger reproductive justice movement.
Yeah, and what really came to mind when you were saying that is it's really like this notion of culturally informed care, right? The fact that you can go to a healthcare provider or a clinic or an organization that that you feel welcome, and really that you have allies, right? Like not just someone to run you in through your medical appointment in 5 to 10 minutes, but someone that you can really entrust your life to. And I think that's critically important here, especially at the border, right? As we've discussed, when we have diverse patient populations from across the Americas and different languages, different cultural backgrounds. I mean, of course, we always talk about how Hispanic, Latina, OX populations just get lumped into one big umbrella with very little nuance for any of the cultural differences. And I can only think there, like how the experiences of transgender women could have been enhanced if the care was better, if there were healthcare providers or workers there that were working to advocate for them, right? Because as we talked about in our article, studies show that LGBTQ plus migrants are among the most vulnerable. They're more likely to be assaulted and killed than cisgender migrants. 88% of LGBTQ migrants are victims of sexual and gender-based violence in their countries of origin, and then that is exacerbated through the migration process. And then 2/3 of them have suffered several attacks during migration, right? So as we've talked about in a lot of our research, this isn't just a reproductive injustice, although it is, right? But it's also a gross human rights violation too. So one thing I was thinking of that we could talk about too is like how we see this fitting under the category of reproductive feminicidios, right? So why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, so reproductive feminicidios builds off of the concept of femicide and feminicidio. So femicide is broadly understood as the killing of women because they are women. Feminicidio takes that a little bit further and talks specifically about the experiences of women in Latin America who experience violence in multiple forms, including but not limited to death. So things like domestic violence would be a manifestation of feminicidio and the culture that feminicidio operates within. And reproductive feminicidios is a concept that we introduced in our book that kind of extends this idea of feminicidio to talk about the ways in which women are punished, the ways in which women experience violence simply because of their reproductive capabilities. So this can include, we kind of talk about it as a spectrum. On one side, it may involve the being mistreated, being harassed when you're trying to access reproductive health care. I think that that's a really common experience for women, for gender nonconforming individuals. Many people can remember at least one healthcare experience where you were at least treated rudely, if not worse. But then on the other end of that spectrum, we have these large-scale societal issues like violence against women, like feminicidio, like police brutality is a reproductive justice issue. It's an example of reproductive feminicidio because it's denying parents the right to raise their children in safe communities, and it's taking children away from their parents, whether they're young children, whether they're grown adults. It's still a reproductive justice issue, just as family separation is. And so we talk about this concept of reproductive feminicidio kind of gives us the language to talk about the ways in which these acts of violence that, can be rhetorical or they can manifest in physical violence, and the ways in which they interfere with our ability to access reproductive justice and the way that they perpetuate injustice and violence, frankly.
Yeah. So let's do a little toss up, right? Because you are absolutely not demoralizing in the slightest. And our friendship and everything we've worked on together can attest to that. But over the last several years, we've combined, with our powers combined in the best Captain Planet way, we've combined our shared interest, right, in health communication, border studies, gender studies, and even environmental comm too, right, to really advocate on behalf of gender violence and reproductive feminicidios as a health communication topic, right? So if I were to tell you that I didn't think this was a legitimate health communication topic, based on your lived experience and our shared research, what would you say?
Oh, no reviewer would ever say that this doesn't count as health communication. Just kidding, they definitely would. I think that it's important to we have too limited a view of what counts as health, what counts as health communication. And I think that it's important to think about health more holistically in a collaboration that you and I are currently working on with our colleague, Carlos Tarin. We talk about the ways in which not being able to attend school in a healthy, safe, environmentally safe conditions. We discuss, I won't go into detail here, but we discuss a case in El Paso where students are being forced to attend a school that is an environmental hazard. And that is an example of it's reproductive justice to advocate for those students to have a safe campus to attend school. It is absolutely a health issue because there are documented cases of health issues arising from having to attend these schools. And so I think that when we think about health communication, we have to think about how do we ensure that thinking about reproductive justice as a health communication issue, how do we ensure that people are empowered to make choices about their own reproductive health, are empowered to have as many children as they want or no children if they don't want to have children? How are they empowered to raise those children in safe environments and safe communities? So really thinking about, what the work that reproductive justice feminists have done, such as I'll mention Sister Song again. They give us this framework for thinking through what counts as reproductive justice and therefore what counts as health communication, and what do we need to do to meet healthcare needs holistically and respectfully.
Yeah, absolutely. And that ties in really well to the next thing I wanted to say, right? Comments we've gotten, if I were a reviewer too, how could we make requirements for journalists to cover this in a more sensitive way, right? What about objective, fact-checking, neutral journalism, right? Because we've spent hours, years, and on thinking about this, right? Like, what do you think is the role of journalism in this larger topic and context, particularly when thinking about the framing of violence against transgender women?
Well, I think that something that we're learning, I'll just share an example from a paper that we worked on for, I believe it was for National Communication Association conference. But we found that when we were looking at the issue of obstetric violence or obstetricians inflicting violence on the bodies of pregnant people, birthing people, we found that many journalists were covering this not from I'm objective. I'm just presenting the facts to you. Nothing is objective. Everything is subjective. We know this. But many feminist journalists went the step further to define the problem, to offer examples. So, now we have a language. Now we have a term, obstetric violence, that we can use to describe what's happening. And then they talked about, what needs to happen, what needs to change, what role do doulas play in keeping birthing people safe during their birth experience. And so I think that, we argue ultimately, and we will continue to argue and continue to do this work. But I think journalists have a responsibility, instead of just producing, in our book, we talk a little bit about this idea that not all witnessing is the same. When a journalist produces a piece, they might, when they're presenting really grisly details of a case, but nothing beyond that, they're creating voyeurs in their audience members. But they have the potential to really do the work, to give us tools and strategies and knowledge that lets us go further as audience members and figure out, okay, I don't like that this is happening. What's my role in changing it? What can I do? What information do I need to make a positive change moving forward? And I really think that is an important role that they can and should play in society.
Absolutely.
Hey, thank you both. That was a great discussion. It's time for me to interrupt you with questions.
All right.
So, I guess the first question I would have is like, how do you feel like research in this area can, or in health communication generally, or in these particular contexts, help inform policy?
Yes.
That is excellent.
I think it's so important for us to combine our efforts, right? So like academics and researchers working with local nonprofits, joining together, doing the work together, and then attacking policy together, right? Like I use California Latinas for Reproductive Justice as an example here all the time because the organization has so many like arms, if you will, in terms of community outreach and education and policy outreach. And I think that's one of the missing puzzles here, particularly when academics do the research and then journalists are covering the research, but it feels like there isn't a lot of conversation among the three.
And I should say, if you're out there listening, if you're on YouTube or Facebook, if you drop a question in the comments, we can surface it here so that our scholars can answer. Another question I have then is, with your communication background, how does your approach then differ from other approaches to research on reproductive justice?
I can start off with that one and you can jump in whenever. Yeah, but I think that, we're really looking at, when we look at media coverage, for example, and we're arguing that it's not objective, that the way that we choose to frame stories, what headlines, what descriptive terms we're using in the stories plays a role in how audiences receive those stories. And so I think that by taking a communication lens to these issues, we can really help to uncover some of the problematic framing of these issues in media representation, but then we also play a role in coming up with terms. But something that I love to share with my communication students when we're talking about the topic of sexual harassment is I like to tell them, this term didn't used to exist. So this behavior always existed. People experience these things in their workplaces, but they didn't know what to do about it because there wasn't a name, there wasn't a title, there wasn't a term that they could kind of rally around to describe this experience. And then when the term is coined, it is powerful. You can make laws about it. You can file complaints about it. You can be trained on how not to do this thing. And so I think, words are powerful. We construct the world around us with words and symbols. That's what we believe as communication scholars. And so I think that it really helps us get at the foundation and root of some of these issues. But I'm curious if there's anything you'd like to add, Leah.
Yeah, no, Sarah, that was great. It also helps us look, I think, at the communicative, like micro level practices that are happening between and among family members when trying to decide their like reproductive health trajectory. Like I've also done a lot of research in genetic testing and prenatal testing contexts, right? And it also helps us look too at how patients and doctors and healthcare providers are making sense of all of these factors as well. So it's like at a macro level, we have like the news, right? And then at the micro level, we have like the actual conversations that are happening about health topics.
Cool. I believe we have a question from the audience, from Teresa Walker. Is there a role for nonprofits who engage in emergency relief and other efforts, and how can they be engaged?
Great question. Sarah, do you have any thoughts on that, particularly in terms of like work you've done with organizations at the border?
I think my best answer to this question would be, and I'm not sure, I know that I can't speak directly to the person who posed the question, but it reminds me of when the issue of children in cages and these detention centers, when it was first, becoming this really publicized issue. People wanted to help. They wanted to do something. And so we had people literally driving to El Paso with truckloads of food, of toys, of things that they wanted to give to these children. But you couldn't get in there. You couldn't give, you couldn't make donations of food or water or toys. And so while these efforts were incredibly kind, well-meaning, it wasn't what people on the ground needed at the time. And so I think that there is absolutely a place for these nonprofits to play a big role. And I think the best strategy is to talk to the people who are doing the work on the ground and figure out, what do you need and how do we best support you? And I don't know if that fully answers the question, but that's just from an experience that I had in the summer of 2019. That's just the first thing that comes to mind.
Okay, we have another question from the audience. This is a long one. I was hoping you could talk about how gun violence, which I believe is still not counted or kept track of, fits into your findings. Does it play a large part in gender and reproductive violence, or are there other influences that are greater?
Ooh, that's a good question. I wouldn't necessarily say that there are other influences that are greater, but I think that it's part of the larger umbrella we're working with here, right? So if we think about reproductive injustices as one strand, intimate partner violence as another strand, gun violence and brutality as another strand, we can see how taken together, all three of these factors are impacting families in radically negative ways. And I remember when George Floyd was brutally murdered last year, and we started seeing kind of like this larger radical racial awakening or racial consciousness. And Sarah and I were touching base about it, as we do. And it's like, well, there is research out there that looks at gun violence and intimate partner violence and how that impacts families. But I feel like it's not necessarily something that reaches the airwaves as much as it could or should. Sarah, did you have anything else to add about that?
No, I think you covered it.
Cool. So I have one more question I'm going to ask you, and then we'll let you go. Some people might assume that reproductive justice is a women's issue. What do you feel is the role of men and non-binary people in reproductive justice?
So I believe it was Bell Hooks who wrote the book, Feminism is for Everybody, right? And I feel like if I could use that, I would say reproductive justice is for everybody too. Sarah, but go ahead. What do you want to add to that?
Well, I would love to plug this organization that I really love, Latinx Parenting. They are on a mission to end what they call chancla culture, which is this idea that if you grew up in a Latinx family, you probably heard jokes about la chancla, the sandal that you're going to get hit with to make sure that you're behaving. And so this culture is rampant. And so the founder of Leslie Ariola Hillebrand, the founder of Latinx Parenting, really talks about how we need to end chancla culture and we need to end adult supremacy and we need to treat children with respect. And, children are these people whose rights are violated all the time, but we don't talk about them. They can't necessarily start their own social movement to get the rights that they deserve. And I believe very strongly that this is a reproductive justice issue. And the founder talks a lot about the ways in which legacies of colonialism inform this desire or this, wanting to parent with this authority and control and violence, whether it's violent words or actually, using la chancla, using the belt. And so I think that I'm currently taking a class with them right now, a 6-week nonviolent, decolonized nonviolent parenting class. And there are many mothers in this class. There are non-binary parents. There are fathers in the class. And we all recognize this role that we need to play to ensure that if our students are going to, in teacher mode, if our children are going to grow up in safe and healthy communities, that starts in our home. And if we're inflicting violence upon them, whether it's through spanking or through, emotional abuse, then that they're not experiencing a safe environment or a safe home, and our family can't thrive that way. And so I think that everyone that's just one small example of one issue where every single person, whether you're a parent or not, you can play a role in treating children with dignity and respect and working to create safe communities and safe environments.
Yeah. And I think Sarah nailed it on the head too earlier when she said it's a more holistic approach, right? So it's advocating on behalf of transgender, non-binary, queer individuals to have the reproductive health care that they need. It's helping us get more access to and information about vasectomies, right? For men and for families, as opposed to oftentimes women bearing the burden of the birth control, right? So I think taken together, these are all a lot of the smaller strands of some of the larger efforts in the movement that are really, I think, hoping anyone who has reproductive functions or may not parent in the future has what they need to make those decisions.
Great. Well, this has been a fantastic discussion, y'all. I'm so happy that you joined us this evening. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And look forward to seeing you again soon.
Thank you so much for having us.
Yeah.
So now to talk about some really good resources you can use if you want to do research in this area, we're going over to Paris Whalen with Check This Out.
Hey, all of our subscribers, all millions of y'all. Welcome to the Check This Out segment. For those of you who are new or just need a quick reminder, this segment basically highlights our subject liaison and focuses on different aspects of information and media literacy in relation to the subject at hand. Today, we're going to discuss information seeking and some thinking skills that we hope will encourage you to find reputable sources so that if you decide to participate in this conversation, you're doing so in a responsible and well-informed manner, okay? Now, here to help me deliver this information and help provide starting points to those of you who want to continue learning, I have Shaina Destine, who is a fellow UT humanitarian librarian with me this evening. Hey, Shaina. I think you're muted.
Hey, how are you?
Great. So just a little background on Shaina. Once again, she's a humanitarian librarian here at UTK, and she's the subject liaison for history and medieval Renaissance studies. She's also a member of the LGBTQ+ community, and she's passionate about justice for oppressed communities across the world and African diaspora. Fun fact about Shaina and I, we both are JWU alumni, although I studied in Providence and she studied in Miami. So did I leave anything else out, Shaina?
I mean, there's a lot to me. There's a lot of layers here, but no. You can sum me up and I love Black Mirror, Black clothing, and Black people.
Awesome. I love it. So with all that being said, thanks for agreeing to be here with me, Shaina, and I'm super stoked to have you and get your opinion in this great discussion. So let's jump right into these questions. I want to start out by asking you, what barriers do transgender migrants experience when trying to access information and on services? And I ask this because the library provides access to information, resources, and services, but what people don't often realize is that access to all information isn't equal. And I'd like to put that into the context of what we're covering today.
Yeah, I mean, they have issues. Like I'm going to be checking my nose. So if you see me look down, that's what I'm doing. So there's access to, there's barriers to access to information regarding law and processes a lot of the time. So, thinking about what's happening with cases that they're involved in, or legal assistance for if they're being violated or being assaulted in some kind of way. There's always barriers to access with employment, and then access to healthcare, right? I mean, we're in a pandemic. There's, access to maybe hormone therapy that they're needing. There's access to maybe mental health issues. Like, there's a lot of things that they have barriers for. And I mean, it's really on us to make that more accessible, because if things are behind a paywall, or if folks don't have access to a laptop or anything like that, then it's like, there's already a kind of like an information poverty there. There's already like an unequal starting point for folks. So yeah.
No, that's awesome. Thank you so much for that. That was a really great answer. So now that we kind of have an idea of the barriers that interrupt access to information that the community has experienced because of, say, their gender identity and sexual orientation, what resources does UTK Library have for those who want to learn more about the LGBTQ plus Latinx experience at the U.S. and Mexico border specifically?
So I went through our databases, and there were two I wanted to highlight as a starting point, right? This is not by any means comprehensive. I want to say that. But there is the Women's Studies International database. And when I was looking through there, if you looked up, I like that database, first of all, because if you put in, let's say, transgender, it'll look up other terms that are related to transgender. So it'll pull up gender variant, it'll pull up gender nonconforming, etc. If you look up migrant, you'll get immigration, you'll get emigration, you'll get those kinds of variants on that word. And also it'll give you refugees, it'll give you displaced persons, and it'll give you asylum seekers. All, if you just put in those terms, it'll pull up related terms. So I like them a lot. We also have a database called the LGBT Source. And that one, I looked through it. I use similar terms. You search coronavirus, and it will pull up COVID-19. It'll pull up SARS-CoV-2, et cetera, related terms. And they had really good articles. There was one particularly called "The Federal Judge Declines to Certify Class of Transgender ICE Detainees." And it talks more about like getting transgender folks who are female or who are women into women's detention centers for more safety, which is, I mean, not great, because we should just not have detention centers. But if we have to have them, let's not put women in with men. Because there's been a high rate of sexual assault, obviously. And then there's a lot of civil litigation notes for people who are suing the government for being wrongly detained or being deported, or things that were just not right with their case. And there were a lot of those. So that I found really interesting. And then there was another article called "Migrating Like a Queen," which I thought was great. So those are databases you can look at, and some articles to get you started.
Thank you so much. That's super awesome. And I know I said UT library resources, but I do want to be honest. I'm a millennial. First thing I did was hop on the internet and check out TikTok and YouTube and kind of seek out some nonprofit organizations that supported this. And that's how I started to get my information. I will say this is just a jump off point. Right. That way you can kind of get your bearing on the information. But
honestly, if you went on, like, I was looking through Google, because I like to do a quick Google search, because that's where people start from sometimes. And I want to see what information it pulls up, because I want to, just to see if it's problematic or like what's happening there. And I was actually really pleasantly surprised by a lot of the articles that came up, because what I'm seeing is that people are writing their firsthand experience, and then and this is the way of the day, and it's getting pulled up on Google a lot faster than the problematic stuff, and a lot faster than the academic stuff. So I found a lot of first person narratives when I just put in transgender and immigration or detention and stuff like that, and it came up and it was beautiful. Like, I loved it. I mean, I hate that they're going through that, but I love that there's a platform for them not to be silenced if they can.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I came by the same search. I actually found a YouTube video. I think Vice, the channel owns it or something, but it was a great, I'll eventually put the resource somewhere. It was a great video. Maybe you will run by it. But this basically, this conversation leads me directly into the next question, which is, what resources outside of the library are available to, say, students, faculty, and staff, and even, the public who want to engage in this conversation or be an active participant fighting against inhumane treatment at the border, or any of the subjects we've really covered today?
So of course there's like national organizations you can kind of like look to, and those would be like the National Center for Transgender Equality, Human Rights Watch, the Transgender Law Center was really good. And then there's a US Transgender Survey, which I came across that had really good information. But I looked up this other grassroots organization called Not One More Deportation. And they have like a lot of firsthand stories. And they also have a list of grassroots organizations that they endorse. So not national organizations, but maybe more regional or more specific. And you can just like use that list, copy paste it, put it in a Word document, and just start looking through those organizations. There was like literally probably like 50 or 60 of them.
Yeah. So I know you said this earlier, but I still want to repeat it. This is not an exhaustive list.
Right, at all.
At all. But we really want to give you starting points. We don't want to overwhelm you because, information overload.
That's the thing.
That's our world today. We don't need any extra help. So we just try to
not all good information. Not all information is good information. So
exactly.
You want to give you a breadcrumb so you could start.
Yeah. So we want for you to gather. Shaina's giving you some databases and articles to start from, so you can go ahead and start gathering valid resources and information that you feel comfortable with in whatever media form that might be. So we're talking video, article, even social media.
Yeah, like that's great.
Yeah. And then you can refer to it and decide if you want to engage in a conversation or if you just want to listen in on a conversation concerning these issues. So the last thing I kind of want to cover this evening is I'd like to discuss some tips for researching these subjects. And I kind of want to start out by giving a warning about headlines. And Leandra and Sarah talked about this earlier. We've learned during COVID-19, this global pandemic, that headlines can be super inflammatory and misleading. And this is why it's really important to click on the article and read it, but also to kind of evaluate the source that it's coming from and what their intentions may be before you share it. I also want to mention, just in case you didn't know, the media can also be super harmful, especially to victims of violence who may be transgender, non-binary, or gender non-conforming people. This is also something that Leandra and Sarah touched on earlier when they were talking about their paper. Whenever news outlets race to be the first to present information to the public, they may use victims' dead names and misgender them, which is a super painful experience and it's invalidating. So as y'all start to research this topic, and I just want for y'all to keep an eye out for irresponsible and sometimes catchy titles that may actually have false information or misleading information.
And also titles that are like fear mongering, right? You can read a title that all of a sudden is like it's something about something simple, but they've tied it to something that's catastrophic as a way to kind of pull on your emotions and get you to click and believe whatever's going on in there. So that's also something to think about.
Yeah. Also, be aware of, satirical sites such as The Onion. You don't want to be too quick to share things just because they seem funny and cool, because that's how mistakes are made. People believe things, and we found that out during this whole situation. So,
that's the thing. I was also like thinking about this when me and you were talking the other day, and I was thinking about there's the obvious, thinking about sources, right? Sources where these articles are coming from. There are sources that we all recognize as being conservative, right? That's like, Fox News and Breitbart and all those things, Washington Times, whatever. But there's also the ones that and there's also the ones that tell on themselves, right? You can tell because it's called like the American Conservative. So, it's a conservative leaning site. So you're like, okay, which is not saying you shouldn't click on it, but just knowing that when you're reading it so that you can kind of understand how that bias is going to change the information, right? But I was thinking about ones that kind of slip through the cracks, right? Because they don't tell on themselves. They have very common names. They're very much they don't tell you either way until you click on it what kind of a site it is. Right. And that would be like the American Thinker, the Daily Caller, the Daily Wire, the Free Republic. Those are not immediately telling you, oh, we're right leaning or we're this or we're that, but they are basically that. They are, and they're going to have a certain bias. So I was just thinking about that. If you're not a person who recognizes those off top, you might click on it not knowing, and then all of a sudden you're ingesting this information and not realizing what the source is. So what I suggest for people is when you see a source, when you see an article, like literally just click take the name of the article, put it into Google, because Wikipedia literally has a blurb about every single source. So it will tell you this is a conservative leaning media coming from this place and, whatever. So you at least know that before you click on it. And that's the same thing with left leaning, right? Like if you are looking for something, click it, or you take the name, just Google it. So you understand what the source is before you even click on it. So before you even ingest that information.
Mm-hmm. Those are some awesome tips, Shaina. Is there anything you want to add to this subject that I didn't cover?
Let me think. Let me see. I think that social media, like we talked about earlier, is wonderful. It does spread a lot of misinformation, but if you can kind of like use your flex your info literacy skills beforehand, it is a great place for finding information and also for organizing. So like you can find other people who are kind of for the same cause as you. And then I think that while you're looking through the couple of sites I gave people, the couple of databases, build your search terms, like as you're reading and getting new information, maybe new laws, maybe different ways people refer to themselves, maybe anything. Write that down and then use that and go back in and search again, because it might pull up different information for you.
Yeah.
And then I think that is it. Oh, use other words. So again, if we're talking about, think about asylum seeker, think about refugee, think about like those other words, pull up different things, because that might be in the title and it might change your search results. So yeah, just a couple of items.
That is really good advice, Shaina. We were actually working on LibGuides recently, and Nikki Kirkpatrick and Melanie were showing off on the left-hand side of their LibGuide where they had started using other words to describe, say, COVID-19, like SARS and whatnot, and how helpful it is to have those key terms off to the side to help people with their searches, because once again, we don't want to hinder anybody from having access to the information that we have at the library. So,
and also just, remember, people aren't one thing. So like, think about the intersections of people's identity and use that in your search as well. Nobody's just one thing. So like, if you're looking for me and you just search woman, I'm gonna be the 60 millionth result that you come up with. But if you search maybe Black woman, queer woman, fantastic woman from the South Bronx, you might get me in search number 3. So
obviously, yes. A very good point. Yes, so narrow down your search results as much as possible. Well, if you have nothing else, I really I appreciate your input on this subject. I appreciate you taking the time out to join me, Shaina. It's always a pleasure.
I love you, Paris. Sending love to everybody during the pandemic.
Yeah. So great discussion. Wait, before we go, I do want to leave our audience with a little bit of a charge, which is basically to consider being more aware of headlines that grab your attention and just be skeptical. Okay, they're going to have misleading and they're going to possibly have misleading information, and I don't want for y'all to fall into that trap. So until next time, do that. Okay. Thank you.
Hello, I am Ingrid Ruffin, and this is Stories from the Stacks, where we discuss important things. So far on Stories from the Stacks, we've focused on specific objects or stories that can be found online or in Hodges Library. Tonight, we're going to dig a little deeper into the rich story of Betsy B. Creekmore's special collections. Our guest tonight is Assistant Professor and Manuscripts Archivist Laura Romans. She has been with the UT Library since 2015. Welcome, Laura.
Hey, Ingrid.
Hey. So first of all, how are you?
I'm great. Very thankful to be here tonight as a part of this program. How are you?
I am hanging in there. So part of your research is working on diversifying our special collections and possibly reaching further than the UT libraries. So what does that mean, and why are you even doing that?
Great questions. So, special collections and archives, right? They're the primary sources of history. And across a lot of institutions, historically, these collections, the ones that have been kept and the way they've been described, have often shown only a very, very small slice of history or a very small slice of the population. A lot of times under the falsehood of, objectivity or neutrality. So, working to diversify our collections can mean a lot of different things, and that can happen in a lot of different ways. But to answer sort of your end question, the goal there is to really get a better representation of history, of people from marginalized communities whose voices have been perhaps left out, who haven't been documented in these collections, or who have been documented, but they've gone unidentified, they've gone undescribed. So a few of the ways that we do that, like I said, there's a lot of different ways, and a lot of people in the special collections world are really doing this work. And one way we can do that is to look at the collections we have and sort of re-examine them. Who is here, who's present from marginalized communities that just haven't been brought to light. Their voices haven't been heard, and let's try to make them heard, make them more visible. And then, of course, growing our collections and developing more representative collections that are truly showcasing the full spectrum of history, the full spectrum of our culture and our region, and all the things that are going on.
Okay, so when you say you're going out diversifying, you try to get all these objects and these things, books, letters, all these, different things. So are you going around knocking on people's doors and asking for their old stuff? Is this how it works?
Not exactly. Casey Fox might have a different answer. Just kidding, Casey. But we definitely are always thinking about, how can we develop our collections to really represent our mission as a part of the library, as a part of the university, a part of our community. And, we work with partners inside the library, inside the university, in the community to find interesting historical material that we think will, support the research and the things that our researchers are doing.
Okay, so I guess that moves to the next question. What are some ways researchers use our special collections?
Gosh, Ingrid, all over the place. We have a lot of researchers, and they're doing all kinds of things, which is what makes special collections so cool. Of course, we work a lot with our fabulous students and our staff and faculty on campus to do, things that you might think of as like the more traditional scholarship. So writing articles, publishing books, presentations, things like that. But also like I said, these materials are the primary sources of history, and they can be used in so many ways. So we also have people that use us as inspiration for art, for music, different things like that. Just any kind of thing you can think of that people are sort of like interpreting history, analyzing history. Lots of different products come out of it, and it's a lot of fun to watch.
Right. So I do know that the UT Libraries, we actually have a project where we bring in artists who have used your special collections, things that you've curated, to create songs and music. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, we started that a couple years ago, and it's called Boundless Artists in the Archives. And it's a really great project where we invite music. So far, it's been musicians. We invite them in. They look at a particular collection or maybe a theme across some collections. And then, they use in different ways, however the material sort of inspires them to then create music. And we've had everything from like an Americana band to a jazz artist. And so, that's like a unique and exciting way that people can come in, use these primary sources, but, interpret it in different ways and use it to create something of their own, and it kind of like keeps this cycle going.
Yeah, so it continues to telling the original person's story, but adding to the story. Okay, so next question. Craziest thing that you have ever found or witnessed in special collections? Can you tell us even?
There's so many, and I feel like it changes all the time. You know, we're coming across just wild stuff a lot. But right now, I would say the thing that comes to the top of my mind, we have a lot of collections of papers from World War II veterans. And one thing I'm always struck by is, you know, so many of these veterans, this was the first time that they like not only traveled outside of their county, but like outside of the country, you know, and they're like traveling across the world. And so a lot of them would pick up souvenirs, different things to bring home. And there have been some pretty weird things that they've kept. And in one collection, a veteran kept a tiny figurine of a seahorse skeleton. There's like no information really about it, what it meant to them. But I just always thought that was a little strange, but I guess it was sort of a piece of maybe where he had been during his military service.
Right. So maybe a future researcher could come in and kind of maybe illuminate that for us. If somebody out there knows why people keep seahorse skeletons, let us know.
Exactly. There's a story to tell for sure.
Always. Okay. So when most people think of archivists, they think of Indiana Jones. Of course, I don't actually think he was an archivist. He was an adventurer or something. Okay. Traveling the world in search of valuable and significant objects. What's one of the most interesting collections? Can you tell us about one of your most interesting collections, acquisitions, experiences? I used a lot of words there.
I knew what you were going for. So first off, I'll say not quite Indiana Jones, never experienced any snakes, although have experienced snake skins in collections. So I guess that's close enough. Okay. But I would say, you know, thinking about meeting with people and working to take their collections in, just when I think about the most interesting things, it's usually that a lot of times, especially when people are handing over like their family's material, you know, things that are just like really sentimental to them, it's actually cool to be a part of that process. Sometimes they haven't maybe looked at the stuff in a while. And so as you're packing it up and taking it to preserve it, they kind of go through this process of like remembering things, remembering their family, different things like that. So it's always cool to sort of like be kind of a fly on the wall in that process as they're sort of like reconnecting with the material and then sort of like passing it on for other people to appreciate and use.
Okay, so we have a lot of collections, right?
Yeah.
A lot of them are digitized, or like we have so many that we haven't even been able to put everything out there for the public to access. So what's one of your favorite collections to work with and why?
Yeah, so I would say, you know, to people that know me, they're going to be like, Laura, not again. We get it. But because I could talk about this forever, but my favorite collection is definitely one that I've done a lot of research on, and that's the Virginia P. Moore collection. And Virginia P. Moore was the first home demonstration agent in Tennessee. And what that means is in the early 1900s, she traveled the state, particularly in rural areas, and she taught girls, young girls, school-age girls, how to farm and can their own produce. And then that sort of eventually extended into more other types of homemaking skills. But one of the things that I really loved about this collection and how I got like so into Virginia Moore was just thinking about how she sort of operated within this very like traditional sphere of, you know, like women being in the house doing these homemaking things. But in a way, she was like really radicalizing what they were doing. She was teaching these girls, you know, how to can their own produce so that they could better feed their families throughout the year, how they could sell it and make money, how to keep up with their finances. So I just always like it's a small collection. It's only a couple of boxes, but I just always love going to it. It has really great pictures in it of girls with their like cans of tomatoes that they're so proud of. So that one is near and dear to my heart.
Yeah, that is a very special one. Okay, so this is my last question.
Okay.
I have some pretty, at least I think, pretty interesting old things just hanging around my house. Right? Museum quality, if you will, or maybe, I don't know. So if I wanted to donate something, how do I do that? Do I just drop it off at the door? Leave it in a random place in the library? How would I do that?
No. Don't go to the trouble of dropping it off for us. But we are definitely open to having conversations with people who think they might have something that fits into what we collect. Things that fit our collection mission and our priorities. So I would encourage people to visit our website. You can navigate to it from the library's homepage, but you can also go scrolling on the bottom here to lib.utk.edu/special. And that's where you can learn everything you'd want to know about special collections, but especially about the types of material that we collect and how to get in touch with us if somebody is interested in starting that conversation. We'd love to do it.
Okay, so thank you so much, Laura. And once again, if you'd like to know more about our special collections, you can go to lib.utk.edu/special and get to know some of our archivists and very special librarians.
Yeah, thanks, Ingrid.
Thanks, Laura. Bye.
Bye.
So here we are again at the end of another show. This is our third episode, and it's the last in what is a very short first season. We're really enjoying doing this, guys, but it's a pandemic. We're tired. So we plan to be back, though. So if you have any ideas on topics you'd like to hear about, do let us know. Casey, Ingrid, do you have anything before we go?
I do find it interesting that we are ending as we began. We began with cats and snakes, and now we're ending with cats and snakes.
It comes full circle.
There you go.
It's life.
The circle of life. All right, then. That's it for tonight, and we'll see you again in the fall.